You've got to know this person. He is a very good man. He's got a 2.5-year-old son. He's not capable of doing this to no 17-year-old girl.
Those were the words of a woman defending a man at the center of a case that would haunt the Wiregrass region for decades. 2 17-year-old girls were found dead, but when investigators examined the crime scene, they didn't find answers, only more questions. No signs of robbery, no clear motive, and nothing that made sense. So why did suspicion begin to focus on that one man? And was he really as innocent as she believed? How did a quiet night turn into one of the most mysterious cases the Wiregrass region had ever seen? Today, we're going to take a closer look at what really happened and why it took nearly 20 years to find the answer. Ozark is a small city in southeast Alabama, home to just under 15,000 people. Much of daily life there revolves around Fort Rucker. In 1999, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where the worst trouble you'd hear about was someone getting pulled over for speeding. But on the night of July 31st, that sense of security was shattered by a case that wouldn't be solved for over 2 decades. The tragedy began as a celebration. J.B. Hilton Green Beasley had just turned 17, and along with her best friend, Tracie Jean Hawlett, she left Dothan in a black 1993 Mazda 929, heading to a birthday party just a few miles away. But somewhere along the way, they got lost, and by the next morning, everything had changed. The silence of the previous night broke at 8 a.m. on August 1st, 1999, when Tracie Hawlett's mother, Carol Roberts, placed a frantic call to the Dothan Police Department. Tracie had failed to return home before her 11:30 p.m. curfew, and by morning her absence could no longer be dismissed as a teenager simply staying out too late. What had begun as a simple worry was quickly escalating into a missing persons investigation. At nearly the same moment that Roberts was making the call, officers with the Ozark Police Department made a discovery roughly 20 miles away. Just before 8 a.m., an officer spotted J.B. Beasley's black 1993 Mazda 929 parked along Herring Avenue, about 30 yards from the intersection with James Street. Although technically a residential road, this particular stretch of Herring Avenue was eerily isolated. Dense woods pressed in from both sides, and there were no houses in sight. Even in daylight, the area felt dim and enclosed. At night, it would have been nearly pitch black. At first glance, nothing about the vehicle suggested violence. There were no shattered windows, no obvious signs of a crash, and no indication that the car had been forced off the road. Investigators would later say that why the girls stopped there remained one of the earliest mysteries of the case. Yet the closer officers looked, the more puzzling the scene became. The Mazda was coated in fresh mud, a striking contrast to the clean and tidy condition described by witnesses only hours earlier in Ozark. Even more perplexing was the mechanical state of the car. The vehicle had reportedly been filled with gas the previous evening, yet the fuel gauge now hovered near empty, suggesting that a significant amount of driving had taken place during the hours the girls were missing. Inside the car, the scene appeared strangely undisturbed. The girls' purses were still inside the vehicle, along with cash, jewelry, and credit cards. JB's driver's license rested plainly on the dashboard. The only obvious item missing was the car's keys, which were attached to a distinctive keychain made of white blocks with black letters spelling out, "Hard to get." The driver's side window was rolled down slightly, and the door was unlocked. Despite these odd details, officers initially saw no immediate evidence of a crime. A sergeant at the scene contacted Lieutenant Rex Tipton, the chief of detectives with the Ozark Police Department. Tipton instructed the officer to simply keep an eye on the vehicle. At the time, the possibility that the car had been left there by teenagers after a late night out seemed entirely plausible. But when the officer ran the license plate, the situation began to shift. The Mazda was registered in Dothan. When Ozark police contacted authorities there, they learned something troubling. Officers with the Dothan Police Department were at that very moment taking a missing persons report from Tracie Hawlett's parents. Even then, there was still nothing visibly wrong with the car. Hours passed with no sign of the girls. By lunchtime, concern had grown significantly. An investigator from Dothan arrived at the scene and made arrangements to have the vehicle towed back to Dothan for further examination. As officers waited for the tow truck, the investigator noticed something simple but critical. The trunk could be opened using a release lever located inside the vehicle, meaning the missing keys were not required. Nearly 6 hours had passed since the car was first discovered. It was approaching 2 p.m. when the trunk was finally opened. Inside lay the lifeless bodies of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett. Both teenagers had been killed by a single 9mm gunshot wound to the head. Tracie shot once in the temple and J.B. once in the cheek. A single 9mm shell casing rested precariously on Tracie's leg. Their bodies showed few obvious signs of struggle. They were fully clothed, but subtle details told investigators that the events of the previous night had been far from calm. Tracie's arm bore scratches, and her jeans were tangled with thorn briars and woodland debris. The nearly new New Balance tennis shoes she had purchased only a week earlier were caked in mud. JB's clothing and shoes were similarly dirty, and both girls' pants were damp below the knee. These clues suggested that at some point during the night, the girls had likely been forced out of the vehicle and into a nearby wooded area before being placed in the trunk. Authorities quickly ruled out robbery as a motive. The girls' purses, money, credit cards, and jewelry were all still inside the car. But the crime scene raised new mysteries. Investigators determined that the murders had not occurred where the Mazda was parked on Herring Avenue. A palm print was recovered from the trunk lid, one of the first pieces of forensic evidence. An autopsy later confirmed that neither girl had been sexually assaulted and that no alcohol or drugs were present in their systems. However, the forensic picture soon grew more complicated. Investigators later recovered male DNA from semen found on the clothing and underwear of J.B. Beasley. The discovery did not match the initial autopsy findings and introduced a troubling new question into the case. When, exactly, had that DNA been deposited? For investigators, this detail raised several unsettling possibilities. One theory suggested that the attacker may have attempted a sexual act after the killings, or that the DNA had been transferred during an earlier struggle. Whatever the explanation, the evidence deepened the mystery surrounding the killer's motive. By the end of that day, one thing had become clear. The crime scene on Herring Avenue raised far more questions than answers. To understand why this case shook the Wiregrass region, you have to look beyond the evidence and focus on the lives of the two teenagers involved. Before we go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always interesting to see how stories like this connect people from different places. Now, J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett were well known in their community in Dothan. Both girls did well in school and served as cheerleaders at Northview High School. J.B., whose 17th birthday had set the night's events in motion, was remembered as a high-energy and multi-talented teenager. Involved in dance, piano, and competitive swimming, she had even worked with several modeling agencies. She had grown up in a stable, supportive home with 4 sisters and a mother and stepfather who were deeply involved in her life. Her friend, Tracie Hawlett, provided a quiet balance to JB's outgoing nature. Tracie was noted for her selflessness and a strong sense of responsibility toward her 2 younger brothers. Her background also carried a poignant connection to the very system now tasked with finding her killer. Her father had been a sergeant with the Dothan Police Department before his death, when Tracie was only 5 years old. And for investigators, understanding who J.B. and Tracie were would become a critical part of the case. In the early stages of a homicide investigation, detectives often look for what is known as lifestyle risk. They search for patterns of behavior, social circles, or personal conflicts that might explain why an individual was targeted. However, as investigators began to profile JB and Tracie, they found a total absence of these traditional red flags. Both were honor students with no history of drug or alcohol use, a fact later confirmed by autopsy reports that found no traces of illegal substances or alcohol in their systems. This profile placed them in what investigators often describe as low-risk victims. In cases like this, when offenders target individuals with no clear vulnerabilities or known enemies, it often suggests a predatory or opportunistic attack. The absence of conflict or known enemies in their lives suggested that their path to Herring Avenue was not the result of a personal vendetta, but a terrifyingly random encounter with a predator. They were two responsible, goal-oriented young women who had simply taken a wrong turn, leaving the Ozark Police Department with very little to go on when searching for a motive. The path that led JB and Tracie to Herring Avenue was paved with a series of small navigational mistakes, decisions that, in the pre-digital summer of 1999, carried far greater consequences than they would today. Without GPS, ride-sharing apps, or even reliable personal cell phones, a wrong turn in rural Alabama often meant relying on paper maps, payphones, and the directions of strangers. That night, the two friends had simple plans. It was J.B. Beasley's 17th birthday, and they were headed to a small field party being held at the rural headland home of J.B.'s friend and fellow dancer, Jana Hare, just about 10 miles north of Dothan. Earlier that evening, Tracie Hawlett had finished her shift in the menswear department at J.C. Penney shortly after 9 p.m. She returned home to change before J.B., who lived on Woodley Road in Dothan, arrived to pick her up sometime between 9:45 and just after 10 p.m. With the birthday celebration waiting, the two teenagers set out for what should have been a quick 10-minute drive north. But somewhere along the way, the route became unclear. By approximately 10:30 p.m., Tracie and J.B. realized they were lost. Police records later confirmed they stopped at a BP gas station near the intersection of Alabama highways 173 and 431 in Headland. There, standing at one of two side-by-side payphones outside the station, they called friends for precise directions to the party. Anxiety began to grip them as they understood the night would not unfold as planned. Tracie's 11:30 p.m. curfew left only a narrow window for the celebration. Despite their efforts, the confusion only deepened. Instead of arriving at the party in Headland, the girls continued driving northwest, unknowingly moving farther away from home. About an hour later, just after 11:30 p.m., their black Mazda pulled into the parking lot of the Big Little convenience store and Chevron station at 763 East Broad Street in Ozark, more than 20 miles off course. The store itself had already closed for the night, but the exterior payphone mounted along the front wall was still active. At that moment, a local woman named Marilyn Merritt and her daughters happened to arrive at the station to buy a soda from a vending machine. J.B. and Tracie approached them and asked for the quickest route back to Dothan. Before leaving, Tracie stepped to the payphone at the far right end of the storefront and called her mother, Carol Roberts. She explained that they had gotten turned around and ended up in Ozark, but that they now had directions and were heading home. Marilyn's later statement helped investigators establish an important reference point. She noted that the girls appeared polite, calm, and perfectly clean and tidy. Following Merritt's directions, they were told to take U.S. Highway 231 south, a straight 20-mile route that would lead them back to Dothan. This interaction established the final confirmed moment they were seen alive. As of 11:30 p.m., J.B. and Tracie were safe. Their car was undamaged, and they were actively trying to get home. However, a grainy surveillance frame from the Big Little store introduced a chilling variable into the reconstruction. At the same time the girls were at the payphone, the camera captured a small white pickup truck at the gas pumps. There was no record of a transaction, and the driver never exited the vehicle in view of the camera. As the girls turned onto the dark Ozark roads to begin their journey home, the white truck also vanished from the frame. For investigators, this established a terrifyingly narrow window of time. Between 11:30 p.m. and the discovery of the car the next morning, an unidentified force intercepted the girls, turning a routine drive home into a forced detour toward Herring Avenue. As the shock of the discovery began to settle, the Ozark Police Department faced immense pressure to find a suspect. In an era before rapid DNA profiling, the investigation relied heavily on witness testimony and traditional detective work. 1 month after the murders, it appeared the investigation had reached a major breakthrough when a 28-year-old local resident named Johnny William Barentine walked into the police station with a disturbing story. Barentine claimed he had witnessed the crime. Over the course of a 4-hour interrogation, however, his account became a shifting landscape of contradictions. At first, he said he had seen a black truck speeding away from the area. As questioning continued, his story changed repeatedly, eventually evolving 6 different times. In its most dramatic version, Barentine claimed he had picked up a tattooed stranger who forced 2 girls into the trunk of a Mazda on Herring Avenue. At one point, he even implicated his own neighbor. Investigators initially treated the confession seriously and arrested Barentine on 2 counts of capital murder, but the case against him quickly began to collapse. Barentine eventually admitted that he had fabricated the story entirely, hoping to collect the $25,000 reward money offered in the case. Physical evidence confirmed that his confession could not be true. Semen recovered from J.B. Beasley's clothing produced a DNA profile that did not match Barentine. In January 2000, a grand jury declined to indict him, and he was cleared of all charges. Just weeks later, another development briefly revived hope in the investigation. In March 2000, a woman living just south of Ozark came forward with information about the night of the murders. She said that late that evening she had heard what sounded like screams, followed by 2 gunshots coming from a wooded area nearby. The woman explained that she had not reported the sounds earlier because she did not want to become involved in the investigation. The area she described sat beside a now vacant property surrounded by trees. 2 deteriorating wooden structures from the World War II era stood on the land. A barn and a partially collapsed garage located roughly 100 feet from the roadway. A search of the area uncovered a spent 9mm shell casing, the same caliber as the casing found in the trunk with the victims. The casing, along with soil samples collected from the ground nearby, was sent to a state forensic laboratory for further analysis in an effort to determine whether the location had been connected to the murders. This discovery forced investigators to reconsider the girls' final route after leaving the Big Little store. Just minutes earlier, they had been given directions to take U.S. Highway 231 south, the most direct route back to Dothan. If the report of screams and gunshots from the wooded property was accurate, it meant that something had diverted them from that path. 2 primary scenarios began to take shape. In one possibility, the girls may have encountered someone who appeared trustworthy or authoritative, someone who persuaded them to pull off the road or follow him to another location. In rural areas, it would not have been unusual for 2 teenagers unfamiliar with the area to rely on a stranger for guidance, especially after already getting lost once that night. The second possibility involved a more direct confrontation. The girls could have been threatened with a firearm and forced to drive to a secluded area. However, investigators noted a practical difficulty with that scenario. If the girls were already driving toward the highway, suddenly stopping and controlling them at gunpoint would have been risky. Inside a moving vehicle, they still had the ability to accelerate, escape, or attract attention. For that reason, many investigators considered a deceptive approach more plausible, an encounter that began as an offer of help or directions before turning into a violent ambush once the girls had been led into a more isolated location. Such a sequence would help explain why the murders did not occur where the Mazda was later discovered on Herring Avenue, and why the vehicle appeared to have traveled through muddy rural terrain before being abandoned. Although these theories aligned closely with the known timeline of the case, none of them led investigators to a definitive suspect. With no suspect emerging from these theories, investigators continued pursuing other leads as the months passed. Several individuals briefly emerged as potential suspects. One of them was a man from Michigan who had attended a party near the area where the Mazda was later discovered. He left town only days after the murders and could not account for several hours of his movements during the night the girls disappeared. Interviews with him continued over the following years, including multiple trips by investigators to Michigan. But DNA testing ultimately failed to connect him to the evidence recovered from J.B. Beasley's clothing. In early March 2000, another man drew attention after being arrested in Jones County, Mississippi, on an unrelated warrant connected to Ozark. He had been staying with relatives in Ozark but left town 2 days after the murders. DNA samples were collected and compared with the evidence recovered from J.B. Beasley's clothing. The results did not link him to the crime. As the investigation expanded, the scale of the search grew rapidly. State and county detectives joined the effort, bringing the total number of investigators working the case to more than 50. An FBI behavioral profiler was also brought in to analyze the evidence. The resulting profile suggested that the killer was most likely a young male who lived a relatively isolated life. In August 2007, the case was featured nationally in an episode of the television program Haunting Evidence, which revisited the murders and renewed public attention. New leads continued to surface during the following years, with interviews conducted across multiple states including Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, Michigan, Arkansas, and South Carolina. Despite the growing scope of the investigation, none of the leads produced the breakthrough detectives had hoped for. While the search for answers continued, the families of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett worked to ensure that the case would not be forgotten. A memorial was established along Herring Avenue near the location where the Mazda had been discovered. Each year, gatherings were held there with candles, prayers, and messages of remembrance, particularly on July 31st, J.B.'s birthday, and on August 1st, the anniversary of the discovery of the girls' bodies.
It's another year without any answers, another year that we're, still trying to find answers.
The vigils served as both remembrance and resolve. Decades after that night in 1999, the murders of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett remained one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in the Wiregrass region. As the years passed without an arrest, speculation surrounding the case only grew stronger. In 2015, the investigation was suddenly thrust back into the spotlight when a local woman named Rena Crum, who had served as a sworn auxiliary officer with the Ozark Police Department, publicly accused members of the department of involvement in the murders. Crum alleged that on the night of July 31, 1999, an Ozark police officer had stopped J.B. Beasley's car and demanded the location of several cassette tapes that supposedly contained recorded conversations. According to her account, the tapes allegedly captured discussions involving illegal cocaine distribution tied to certain law enforcement figures. Crum suggested that the encounter escalated, ultimately leading to the deaths of the two teenagers. She further claimed that multiple officials were aware of the incident and had worked to conceal it by threatening witnesses and removing evidence connected to the crime. Several officers, including Gary Butch Whittington, Rex Tipton, and Eddie Henderson, were named in her accusations. She also alleged that then Police Chief Tony Spivey had been involved in suppressing information about the case. Despite the seriousness of the allegations, Crum did not publicly identify the officer she claimed had actually committed the killings. Her claims circulated widely online after being amplified by articles and discussions across numerous true crime forums and websites. At the time, the accused officers strongly denied any involvement in the murders, and investigators found no physical evidence connecting them to the crime. In January 2016, several of the officers responded by filing a lawsuit against Crum and others associated with the allegations. The suit, brought by Keith Kaufman, Rex Tipton, Tony Spivey, Eddie Henderson, and Gary Butch Whittington, claimed libel, slander, and defamation of character. The lawsuit argued that the accusations had severely damaged their reputations and careers. Later that same year, Crum herself faced legal trouble in an unrelated matter. In May 2016, she received a suspended sentence and a $250 fine after being convicted of harassing J.B. Beasley's sister. The defamation lawsuit filed by the officers remained in court for nearly 2 years before it was ultimately dismissed in February 2018. The episode illustrated a troubling reality. After years without answers, speculation and accusations had begun to fill the vacuum left by the stalled investigation. Yet despite the intense public speculation, none of the claims produced evidence capable of advancing the case. For nearly 2 decades, the investigation remained stuck in the same place. By 2019, the murders of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett had remained unsolved for nearly 2 decades. The key piece of evidence, the unidentified semen recovered from J.B.'s clothing, had been entered into the FBI's CODIS database countless times. Each search produced the same frustrating result: no match. This suggested a troubling reality. Whoever committed the murders likely had no prior felony convictions requiring a DNA sample. In practical terms, the killer existed outside the traditional forensic system. The breakthrough came through a relatively new investigative tool known as investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG. In March 2019, investigators sent the preserved DNA evidence to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based laboratory that specializes in DNA, phenotyping, and genealogical analysis. Instead of searching for a direct match, scientists compared the DNA profile to distant relatives who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic data to public genealogy databases. By mapping those relationships and constructing an extended family tree, investigators gradually narrowed the list of possible suspects. Eventually, the genetic trail led to one name: Coy Lewis Coley McCraney. Before moving in for an arrest, investigators needed confirmation. Detectives quietly collected discarded items from a public trash area connected to McCraney's residence. DNA recovered from the trash was compared with the biological evidence from the crime scene. The result was definitive. The profiles matched. For the first time in 20 years, investigators believed they had identified the man responsible for the murders of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett. On March 19, 2019, McCraney was stopped during a traffic stop in Daleville, Alabama, and taken into custody. He was charged with 2 counts of capital murder and 1 count of first-degree sexual assault. For the first time in nearly 20 years, investigators were ready to say it publicly.
Okay, I thank everyone for coming today. On August 1st of 1999, 2 Dothan teens were found murdered here in Ozark on Herring Avenue. For more than 19 years, the persons responsible for the crime has been a mystery to us all. Last fall, I sought the services of Parabon Nanolabs, a DNA technology company in Virginia, to assist us in the investigation. The genetic genotyping yielded a match to the DNA sample, again taken from the crime scene in 1999. Now, on March 15th, 2019, investigators located and arrested 45-year-old black male Coley McCraney of Dothan. McCraney grew up here in Ozark, and he attended all of his schools here in Ozark.
For years, many people in Ozark had assumed the killer was a stranger passing through town that night. But the reality was far more unsettling. At the time of the murders in 1999, McCraney was 26 years old and living on Lysenby Drive in Ozark, less than a mile from where the victim's car was later discovered on Herring Avenue. An Alabama native, he had graduated from Carroll High School in Ozark in 1992, where he had been active in school organizations before joining the United States Air Force. McCraney served in the Air Force from 1993 to 1997. In the years that followed, he built what appeared to be a normal life. He worked as a long-haul truck driver and later helped establish a small church where he served as a bishop. Aside from a child support issue in the late 1990s, he had no significant criminal record. To investigators, the realization was chilling. For 2 decades, the suspect had lived quietly within the same community haunted by the murders. The arrest brought a surge of emotions for the families of JB and Tracie. After years of uncertainty, there was finally a suspect, but the news also reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Yet the case was far from over. Because the crime had occurred 20 years earlier, preparing the case for trial required years of additional legal work. Prosecutors and defense attorneys had to review decades-old evidence and address the relatively new science behind genetic genealogy. Finally, in April 2023, the long-awaited trial began. The prosecution built its case around the DNA evidence recovered from J.B. Beasley's body and clothing. Forensic experts testified that the genetic profile matched McCraney with extraordinary certainty. Prosecutors argued that the evidence placed him directly at the center of the crime. They described the murders as a brutal encounter between 2 teenagers who had become lost and a man who chose to exploit their vulnerability. The defense challenged that narrative. When McCraney took the stand, he did not deny the presence of his DNA. Instead, he offered a different explanation. He claimed that he had encountered J.B. Beasley earlier that night and that the two had engaged in a consensual sexual encounter inside her car. According to McCraney, he left the girls alive and drove away. He insisted that he had nothing to do with the murders that followed. McCraney's attorneys argued that while the DNA evidence proved contact, it did not prove murder. They suggested the possibility that the DNA could have been transferred under circumstances unrelated to the killings. Without eyewitnesses placing McCraney at the scene or additional physical evidence directly linking him to the crime, the defense claimed the prosecution's case relied too heavily on DNA alone. They also emphasized McCraney's personal history, a military veteran who had lived quietly in the community for years without a significant criminal record. According to the defense, it seemed unlikely that someone with such a background could commit such a brutal crime and then return to an ordinary life without raising suspicion. Prosecutors challenged that account, pointing out that there was no evidence to support such a meeting. They also highlighted key details from the crime scene: the mud-covered clothing, the thorn briars tangled in the victim's jeans, and the missing car keys. Most importantly, both girls were eventually found inside the locked trunk of their own vehicle. To the prosecution, the consensual encounter explanation was simply a last-minute attempt to explain away the DNA evidence. The trial was emotionally charged. Family members described the daughters they had lost and the decades spent searching for answers. JB's mother, Cheryl Beasley, spoke about her daughter's vibrant personality and the devastation of losing her so suddenly. Tracie's mother, Carol Roberts, described her daughter's kindness and the unbearable pain of knowing she could not protect her. Investigators who had worked the case over the years also testified. They described the early dead ends, the frustration of unanswered questions, and the moment when the DNA evidence finally pointed them toward a suspect. After weeks of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Coy Lewis McCraney was found guilty of the murders of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families, the verdict marked the end of a decades-long search for answers, but it could never bring their daughters back. The decision brought a mixture of relief and grief. Speaking after the trial, J.B.'s mother, Cheryl Beasley, said that justice had been served, but nothing would ever fill the hole left in their hearts. For the community of Ozark, the conviction helped lift a shadow that had hung over the town for more than 20 years. Yet the case also left lingering questions. Why did McCraney commit the crime? And was it a calculated act or a chance encounter that turned deadly? The case also became a powerful demonstration of how modern forensic science has transformed criminal investigations. For decades, investigators believed that if a homicide was not solved within the first 48 hours, the chances of solving it dropped dramatically. The Beasley-Hawlett case challenged that assumption. As long as biological evidence is preserved, time is no longer the ally of the perpetrator. Eventually, science catches up. For years, residents of Ozark had wondered who could have committed such a brutal crime. In the end, the answer proved more unsettling than anyone expected. The killer had been living quietly among them the entire time. The arrest of Coley McCraney was not simply the conclusion of a long investigation. It was a reminder that persistence, technology, and the determination of investigators and families can eventually bring truth to light, even decades after a crime has been committed. And after 20 years of silence, the evidence from that summer night in 1999 finally spoke.